Thank you all for joining us for our first ACO webinar. If you're new to our events and want to learn more about the ACO and medical orgone therapy, you can listen to our podcast and visit our websites, orgonomy.org and adifferentkindofpsychiatry.com. I'm Dr. Crist Burritt, a psychiatrist and clinical associate of the American College of Orgonomy. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Peter A. Crist is president of the American College of Orgonomy and on the faculty of its medical and social orgonomy training programs. Board certified in psychiatry, internal medicine, and medical orgonomy, he treats children, adults, couples, and families in his private practice near Ringgoes, New Jersey. He is also president and CEO of ErgoNexus LLC, a work-life business consulting practice with a functional approach to organizational problems, work relationships, and consulting with individuals from executives to staff. Today in Dealing with Pandemic Panic, the fresh approach of medical orgone therapy, he will talk about emotional reactions to the coronavirus pandemic, how his patients are dealing with it, and how the tools of medical orgone therapy that work so well in person can be successfully adapted to phone and video sessions. Dr. Crist.
Thank you, Dr. Burritt. And I'm looking at the list of people who are attending, and welcome all of you. It's wonderful to see people from so many different areas and from all around the world. So the COVID-19 pandemic has been and continues to be a perfect storm of emotional reactions. With the uncertainty, we have tremendous anxiety, often anxiety tipping to the point of panic in many people. We have anxiety about every aspect of our lives: financial, personal, physical, and social. And we also have fear of death, fear of illness, and frustration about the restrictions that have been put on all of us that have prevented us from going about our lives, and as well as loss of freedoms, movement, assembly, commerce. And in addition to all of that, and on top of all of that, is a sense of grief about not just the loss of loved ones, but also the loss of our normal lives. And it leaves all of us with a tremendous uncertainty about how to go forward and how we will go forward in the future. And I will come back over and over to that, the issue of uncertainty, because it's natural to be anxious in the face of uncertainty. And I'll be talking about that more. And last weekend, I mentioned to a friend of mine that I was going to be doing a webinar on the emotional reactions to the COVID-19 pandemic. And my friend said, "So how are people reacting emotionally?" So I'm going to give you some reactions, and then I'll come back and attempt to answer the question that my friend asked. So Janet is a 65-year-old housewife who I began seeing in individual therapy some time ago, and I've continued to see in couples therapy with her husband. And she is absolutely terrified that she is going to become sick with the COVID-19 virus. And every time she goes outside, even if it's just to walk up and down her deck, she will have to come back inside and shower and change her clothes. And if she goes down to pick up the mail, she has to do the same. She'll bring it up. She will put it out on her porch and spray it with Lysol, turn it over on the other side, spray that with Lysol, all the while wearing rubber gloves and a mask to protect herself. And she'll leave the mail out for a day or two until she feels confident that it's safe to bring in. And as she told me about her need to change her clothes and to shower every time she comes back in from outside, what she described to what she said to me is, "Do you think that's crazy?" And I said, "Yes." She said, well, why? And I said, because there's absolutely no objective evidence that out in the rural area you're living in that this virus is floating around in the air. And she said, well, I know it's, I know you're right that it's crazy, but I feel like I just am compelled to do it. I have to do that in order to feel better. And I said, well, if it makes you feel better and it's not hurting you or anybody else, then go ahead and do it as long as you need to until you find some other ways to handle your anxiety. And her husband is a physical therapist who has been very much into body work and yoga, and had planned early in March to go to a conference up in Massachusetts. Janet had also signed up for that because she's been studying yoga over the last couple of years along with her husband. And they had planned a getaway. And once the pandemic became part of the news, she said that there was no way she was going to go. He insisted on going and saying that, well, it's medical people that are involved. They would know whether it's safe or not. And she said, well, whether you go or not, I'm not going to go. And then finally, she persuaded him at the last minute when she learned that the instructor of that course was going to be coming the day before the course from a month-long trip in Europe, coming through the airports of Europe. She said that she just could not tolerate having him go. So I will come back to that couple, but another example is Shirley, a retired school teacher who said to me, I'm really frightened. She said, it's really scary what's happening out there. And then Jeffrey, a 45-year-old Wall Street executive who's a recovering alcoholic, said a few weeks ago to me, it seems crazy to shut business down. There haven't really been that many deaths compared to from so many other things. Then on April 2nd, he missed his next appointment. And when I hadn't heard from him by April 8th, the day before his next scheduled appointment, I emailed him to let him know that as of April 3rd, I had decided to err on the side of caution and see people only virtually by video sessions. And I want to read you his email response because I think it's illustrative of the kind of reaction that he had. So he responded that evening to me, thanks for reaching out. Sorry for missing my last appointment. It has been difficult to keep track of what day it is, and I did not realize I missed our session until I was in bed and realized it was Thursday. I appreciate you offering to have our session tomorrow by video. I think I would prefer to resume when things settle down and you feel comfortable with in-person sessions again. I find the video is not the same for me, and I'm just hunkering down, trying to focus on work and keeping the house in order. I think this virus stuff will be worked out in 3 or 4 weeks. I remind you, this was April 8th. If that's not the case, I'll consider a substitute to an in-person session at that time. Stay safe. Then another case, Karen is a 45-year-old corporate executive who called for an extra session because conflicts with her husband had really heated up since both of them had to be home and could not go into work. And she said they'd had an incident over the weekend. She said, I'm just feeling so isolated and need some perspective about whether this is my problem or his. And there are many more cases that I could cite, but many reactions, as I'm sure all of you know, are not just from people who are patients, but from every single person. And I want to just mention a few. So early in the restrictions, my wife invited a friend to come over to walk the dogs as they always had and said, you don't need to come into the house. We'll stay 6 feet apart walking the dogs. And the friend said, I feel like it's my civic duty to stay home, like I'd be cheating if I went out. And around the same time, someone else we know had invited a friend over to have tea and to watch a movie sitting 6 feet apart on the sofa. And that she also said she was afraid to tell her online bridge club about it for fear that they would judge her for doing something wrong. And someone else we know said, America has had it so good for so long that we deserve to have this happen. So this is a point where I would use my usual method of Socratic teaching to ask the audience what you thought. And just before we started the webinar, I realized there's no way that I can do a Socratic method without being able to interact directly with the audience. So I'll have to play both Socrates and Plato for you. So what do they have in common? So to answer my friend's question about how people are reacting emotionally to the COVID-19 virus, I said to him, they're reacting each in their own individual way. And I want to share a slide with you. So as one of the key things that we work with in medical orgone therapy is understanding the person's individual character. And the way we understand character is it's the specific overall way somebody reacts to their emotions and the world around them. And this is different than the typical use of the word character in common parlance that often carries a moralistic quality or moralistic tone with it. That is such as you have a good character or a bad character. And so let me end the. So if we look at each of the people that I described, Janet, who's fearful of getting sick, that is her typical reaction to everything, is to be extremely excitable, react and be afraid and go into a panic. George, her husband, the word we've always used with him is that he compartmentalizes things and he dismissed the seriousness of it. And Shirley, the woman who said, I'm scared, it's really frightening out there. In her session, I said to her, what is it that's frightening to you? And she said, there's so many people dying. And I said, well, one of the key things we have to do is look at, is it rational fear? In other words, directly related to an objective threat, or is it irrational fear, something coming from inside you? And she said, well, it's obviously rational fear because it's really scary what's going on out there. And so that's an example of how difficult it is, I think, for people to just look and sort things out. Then the reaction of Jeffrey, who I read the email from, that's his typical reaction is, nothing's a big deal, everything's fine. If there's a problem, it'll go away. In fact, that's part and parcel of the aspect of his character that was drawn to alcohol and drugs just to calm everything down. Then the reaction of Karen with the increased marital tension, that's something that we see a tremendous amount of, and I'm sure every one of you either has experienced that yourself or know someone whose the tensions in the relationships have tremendously increased since the coronavirus pandemic. Oh, I want to go back for a moment to Jeffrey, that him forgetting his session. This is something that I've dubbed pandemic brain, that I know I keep forgetting dates and times, forgetting things that I was trying to remember. So just keep in mind, whenever anybody is under stress, it will do two things. It will put pressure on the person's character, their typical way of handling things, so they can be overwhelmed, and it will make it hard to stay in contact. And that's another basic principle that I want to illustrate with a diagram that what we call contact is when, I just discovered I have a little laser pointer here that I can use. So what genuine contact means to us as orgonomists, and this is a central principle in medical orgone therapy, is understanding the extent to which someone is really connected with themselves or out of touch with themselves. And the basic principle is that if we accurately perceive the excitation in us, and I'll give just a quick example. For if we're sitting next to a loved one and we feel a sensation of warmth in our chest and that feeling of love towards them, that would be an integrated perception of the energy excitation expanding out in feeling the love and the sensation of warmth. If we were somehow partially blocked, we might not perceive the emotional part of that, but just the sensation and just feel feeling of warmth in our chest, but not the emotion of love. Or if we were schizophrenic, we might have a distorted perception and believe that the person sitting next to us was actually putting hot coals on our chest. So I will return to this principle about excitation and perception because it is fundamental to understanding what happens when a situation stirs people up. And so the person will either disconnect from, well, actually, let me put that back up because I think it's worth just staying with that. For example, in the threat of the coronavirus, the extent to which that is threatening us, it will stir us up, we will become excited, and the key thing is whether we can integrate that perception to stay in touch with what's going on. And I've been using this spectrum that people seem to fall on the spectrum somewhere between ostriches who stick their heads in the sand and don't look, and chicken littles who are running around like the sky is falling. And the first couple that I mentioned, I think, is a perfect example of that dichotomy that happens between with people. She is clearly the chicken little. He is the ostrich, basically acting like no big deal, no problem. And the problem with both the ostrich and the chicken little is that they don't either look or don't see, and that's what in medical orgonomy we would call having an eye block. And so when that happens in a mass of people where anxiety starts to not be seen and perceived clearly, you get the reaction of panic, because basically it's called blind panic for a good reason, that the person does not see clearly. And when that panic causes a reaction in someone else, you can basically see an infectious panic or mass hysteria. This is an absolutely natural phenomenon in nature. And the problem is that birds have their perception integrated with their excitation, whereas humans often do not. And so that's a fundamental difference in what can happen with human beings when things go off like that. And the other principle that I think is crucial that we see in many situations is the tendency for people in the face of uncertainty to not be able to tolerate that anxiety and to jump to a conclusion. And I thought that there was a spectrum between observers and conclusion jumpers. But what I've realized that matches the ostrich versus a Chicken Little. But what I realized is that the ostrich and the Chicken Little both have jumped to a conclusion. The Chicken Little has jumped to the conclusion the sky is falling. The ostrich has jumped to the conclusion I don't have to look. There's no problem here. So let me just mention a couple of other examples that illustrate from my own practice that illustrate some of those tendencies. And this seminar was actually scheduled at the same time I was to do a follow-up with on the case that I presented last August of the little girl Lucia, who, if you want to listen to the story from then, it's actually on one of the podcasts on our podcast network from last August. But last weekend, Lucia's mother, they live about 3 hours away, so I only see them about once a month. And they canceled starting in their session in March. And so last weekend, Lucia's mother contacted me and said that Lucia's having some trouble with just not feeling good about herself and being hard on herself and not being able to handle what's going on. So I had a video session with her on Wednesday, and I wish I could read the notes from the entire session, but you'll get a feeling if you listen to that podcast of how remarkable this young woman is. So when I asked her, what are you afraid of? She said, now remind you that she's now 13 years old. She said, well, I'm afraid my aunt could get sick. She's immunocompromised. I mean, I don't know how many 13-year-olds throw those words around, but she said she's immunocompromised. I'm afraid she could get sick. My mother also has asthma and is at risk. And then she said, I'm also afraid that I'll never get back together with my friends. One of my friends' mothers put together a Zoom meeting because she thought we should all connect with each other. And she said, so there were 5 13-year-old girls sitting on Zoom with nothing to say, nothing to talk about. And after 15 minutes of awkward silence, we all left the Zoom meeting. And so as we talked about it a bit more, she said, I don't feel like I'm able to connect with people that way. And when everybody had their camera off, because if I see that everybody is watching me, I start to feel uncomfortable and afraid. And then as we talked more about what else she was afraid of, she said, well, I've read about the fact that people can have COVID-19 disease and not show any symptoms. So I'm afraid I could be an asymptomatic carrier. And just as a footnote, that's, I think, an illustration of part of this young woman's nature, that she really cares about other people, even though she may be shy and inhibited. And she projects it that she's afraid she will become a carrier and hurt somebody else. And we talked about the fact that she's hard on herself. She tends to hold back all of her emotions, particularly any anger, frustration, or fear. And she's quite aware, and we talked about it, that she tends to turn those against herself rather than feeling good about herself. And she quite poignantly said when she's playing the oboe, other people, her teacher, other people will tell her that she's doing very well. She says, I know they're saying good things but it doesn't feel like it's as good as they seem to think it. They're saying that it is. And she said, I don't feel like I can feel good about anything as long as I haven't accomplished anything. And she said, without being able to do our concerts, without being able to show that I've actually finished something, it doesn't feel like I can feel good about it. And we had a remarkable discussion about the difference between being process-oriented and results-oriented. And the final thing that she said in all of that was, again, her fear that somehow people won't want to actually get together once all of this is over, that this will have set a pattern that they won't be able to connect with each other. So one of the other aspects about the spectrum of conclusion jumping and observers is, I'll just mention a bit about the interaction between my wife and me. Early on in our marriage, she got me to reveal that I had a motto, which I didn't even know I had, and I told her my motto is "We'll see." And early in our marriage, she did something, and I said, "You're jumping to a conclusion," and she said, "I'm an expert at that." And then we've since then we've had the joke, if conclusion jumping were an Olympic sport, you'd be a gold medalist. And that spectrum from conclusion jumping to observers, I have always been an observer of nature. I've loved being out observing nature. And a basic principle of the functional method of science that we teach at the college is observe, 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 or perceive, perceive, perceive until a conclusion spontaneously comes to you. And that conclusion is based on directly mirrors an actual phenomenon in nature rather than some preconception or misperception in the person's mind. And in this situation with the pandemic, I've realized that I am more of an ostrich than I had known before. That my tendency, once I was under stress, what came out in my character was just stoically get down to work and get things done. In fact, that aspect of it came home to me when I'm fortunately surrounded by my wife and a dear friend and other people who sent me red alerts that they were concerned that I was putting myself at risk by continuing to see people in person rather than by video. And what I realized is any one of our traits can be both a very positive thing. So me as an observer is great, but if I'm that bird on the ground observing, 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 is that really a coyote? Is that a fox or is that a coyote? I'm going to be dinner. And so there are times where it's absolutely rational and functional to jump to a conclusion. In this situation, man has actually evolved, someone called man the storytelling animal, and said that man can make up a story with two pieces of information, and gave the example that if you see a wiggly stick on the forest floor, it's better that you jump out of the way and jump to the conclusion that that was a snake rather than investigate whether it was a stick until you're sure. And so one principle that I hope you will all take home is looking at what are your typical reactions, because I believe this pandemic, as I said, has brought everybody's character really very much to the fore. And this is an opportunity for each person to really look at how do you react to things and observe those. And one of the other key principles that we teach in orgonomy, particularly in the aspect of orgonomy that we call social orgonomy, looking at how people interact with each other is what matters is not what people say or their intentions. What matters is the actual effect they have. And I know many of you may have come to this webinar hoping that we would talk about the whole social implications of what's going on. This is in the case presentation series to focus on medical orgone therapy. And what I know that there are many aspects of what's going on out there that we need to know more about, that would be useful for us to look at. But we just don't have the time to do that. But if you use the basic functional scientific method that I mentioned, perceive, perceive, perceive until a conclusion spontaneously comes to you, the crucial thing is to differentiate observations or perceptions from conclusions. And in the social realm, it's extremely difficult these days to differentiate fact from opinion, but that's the only way we have a chance of really identifying and looking at what is actually going on. And I will give you my opinion, which is, unfortunately, the news media to a great extent are heightening excitation and stirring up anxiety and panic rather than actually having enough facts to help people get better perspective about what's going on. But there's one aspect of the social realm that I want to just at least mention and touch on, and it follows directly from what I described with that video of the birds taking off from the tree. That kind of startle reaction, anxiety can be transmitted socially from one person to another easily. And if people have trouble tolerating the intensity of their emotions, what orgone therapy is all about is helping people face their emotions as in the situations that I was describing with my patients. That's the underlying principle, is helping them face their anxiety and work through it rather than avoiding it. So there are two tendencies that happen. One is that the person will shut down on themselves and neurotically suffer with their own inabilities to tolerate their emotions. Or there's another tendency that I think was illustrated actually quite remarkably by the first case that I presented of Janet and George. George's complaint, he compartmentalizes things. He's the low-key one. But what his major complaint was that Janet would not tolerate him just doing things his own way. She insisted that he actually also take a shower and change his clothes every time after coming in from outside. And that principle of someone not being able to tolerate someone else's way of handling things, someone else's movement, is what in orgonomy we call the emotional plague, which is a tendency to not be able to stand feelings and try to stop those feelings by stopping movement around us. And I ask each of you to consider really looking much more deeply into that and look around you at the effects, not what the experts or politicians say, but and their intentions, but look at what the actual effects are. And I would say, to a great extent, we see many situations where movement has been stopped, and it's not truly clear, and I don't think we will know for some time to what extent that was necessary. And Wilhelm Reich was the one who developed orgonomy and started the science of it. And someone once told me that all of his understanding of psychopathology is that it can be boiled down to the fear of the spontaneous. So with our patients, we're trying to help them tolerate their spontaneous emotions, and we need to help people tolerate their spontaneous emotions so they don't have to inhibit others out of their own intolerance. So I will stop there, and Dr. Burritt will help field the questions for us.
Hi. So you mentioned the transmission of anxiety and how that can be infectious. I know a lot of participants are curious specifically in how that relates to raising children. I know you mentioned couples, husband and wife. The audience was curious what advice you might have for addressing that transmission to children, or what parents can do in addressing any concerns that come up with their children, or what to say and so forth.
Yeah, so this is always the difficulty, especially if I can't directly interact with someone with that question, because everybody is so different, and I don't think it would be wise for me to make some blanket statement about what someone should do to handle it. But the basic principle, I think the key thing is for people to work as hard as they can on improving their perception, so that they can observe, and see the effect that they're having. And you take some risks of telling a child what you're feeling and seeing if that helps them, or you may need to be more stoic yourself. So there's no cookbook or overall answer.
Thank you. Your discussion brings up a lot for me in my own patients, and you mentioned it helped you see yourself a little bit more. I know it's done the same for me, and actually hearing you speak about it reminded me even just my tendency to say things are fine, tell myself things are fine. And I can, as you were speaking, I could hear me tell my wife when she was delivering her second daughter, you're fine, you're fine, you're fine, I'm fine. And I heard myself, I'm fine. And I had and I think I can have that tendency for other events too, including this pandemic. I noticed in myself that tendency to, this is a serious concern, but I'm fine, and I'm just going to continue as best I can to continue my life as normal. And I think this is affecting everybody. And
yeah, I think that's the central point, is to understand that this is a period unlike any that I've ever experienced, where everybody is aware of and affected by exactly the same phenomenon at every aspect of our lives. And I've been at this a long time, looking at my own character, trying to improve it. And as I said, I've been surprised to things that I've learned. I mean, even just as I was preparing the introductory remarks for this webinar, grief was the last one that came to my mind of all of the emotions. And that's just so deep in my character, to be the New England stoic and just get down to work. And it wasn't until looking at that I realized, my God, I have just been feeling more sad than I realized. Unfortunately, I was able to have a good cry yesterday. I guess that's one of the things I would encourage people to do, is just look at the emotions that are there and see what they need to do to let them out, because that it is an excitation that needs discharge.
Thank you for that. And that brings to mind the idea that everyone is often stuck in their house or has more time on their hands, and everyone's talking about what do we do with that time. I think what you just said stands out, because part of what we need to do with that time is allow ourselves just to feel what's going on and not distract ourselves from that. Is that what you mean?
Yes, yeah, that's what I mean. And you've actually brought up something that I wanted to be sure to mention. And I would like to have the final poll put up, because I think many people have mentioned that there are positive reactions they've had to this whole situation. And I'd like to just get a sense from the audience how many of them have had that kind of reaction. And I think for each person, it may be something different, I know I started off saying, oh, good, a lot of things are canceled. I'll have some free time. Well, that didn't turn out so well, but I've been busier than ever. But a number of people have said, yes, it's given a sense of simplicity. And that's the other thing is don't forget is, and it's a little bit part of what's frightening about the restrictions that are being put on by government agencies, that there is a relief when you don't have to make decisions. That does reduce uncertainty, and that's both good and bad. It's the basis under which dictators can take power. Not that I'm saying that we're in that state now, but it's certainly worth remaining concerned about. I mean, if you think about it, the basic principles, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in our Declaration of Independence, all of those have been affected by this. And some of the basic Bill of Rights, the right to assembly, the right to free commerce, all of those things have been affected. And there's going to be debates for a long time whether those measures that were used to deal with the pandemic were necessary in restricting those rights.
So one of the audience members has a question. The question is, if we are shutting down, it feels like the opposite of excitation and certainly feels sufferable. In regard to perceive, how can one get out of the cycle of self-suppression?
It's a very, very good question. And I think it goes back to some basic principles of medical orgone therapy. We are looking at how people handle their energy. When we talk about emotions, we understand that as energy moving in the body. So how somebody handles their energy, if you're in a state of contraction, it's very important to find ways to get moving and to have outlets for energy. And that's why the measures are so terrible. It's the natural outlet in work has been severely affected. I am lucky because I live out in the country and I take a 3.5 mile walk with my dogs every morning. And I would encourage other people, if they can tolerate it, and again, always look at the effect. Does it have a good effect on you or not? Do what you can to get moving physically and to find outlets for your emotions so you're moving emotionally.
Another question that came up, why have we not reached this level of excitation with other kinds of epidemics or diseases affecting our society in general? And I don't know the full history of it, but there does seem to be something different about this. But if that's the case, is there anything different about what's going on now that you've observed?
Again, all along, and I still think we're at the point where there's tremendous uncertainty, and I've been intrigued by how this pandemic crosses so many of the basic realms of orgonomy. And just to define, orgonomy is the science of man's relationship with nature. Medical orgonomy is how it deals with understanding health and treating diseases. And then there's social orgonomy that deals with how these principles relate to interactions and relationships between people. And so there's the biology of this particular virus. And there's evidence, I think pretty solid evidence, that it is different in some way than many others. That the contagiousness of it, I think, is beyond many others. But then we get to dealing with how it shows up in the social realm. And I think that has to be looked at as a part of why this is different. There's something different in our social environment in the last few years than was previously true. But again, just looking at what's going on is what we need to do. I don't see anything to do urgently or emergently about it, except pay attention to any way that we can get things moving again rather than shut down.
So it looks like the polls suggest the majority of our attendees have been surprised by the positive reactions that they've had.
Uh-huh. I would invite some of you to write on the Q&A section, just even if it's not a question, just some observations of what you've noticed so that we can share this with people. So is anything coming up there? Actually, while you're looking at that, I want to just underscore one other thing is that today can only be the beginning, a tip of an iceberg of looking at how this pandemic is affecting people individually and socially. And, the college will continue with its training program in medical ergonomy, social ergonomy, and continue looking at how it's affecting people in both of those realms. And, we will continue having additional presentations on medical ergon therapy to help people understand how this may apply. I guess that's one of the other things that I want to underscore is these principles are nothing different in this setting than they are in when there isn't a pandemic. What we do to help people is the same. It's just that this has heightened many people's character reactions. So, and I've been quite pleased to see how easily doing video sessions can translate to working with people in the same way. I've been doing video sessions for a long time in my business consulting because one of my companies is in New Zealand that I work with, and that's impossible to do in person very easily. So, if an understanding of character, and I want to emphasize that's really core and crucial as a basic principle in medical orgone therapy. That can be conveyed and worked with, whether it's by telephone, by video, in person. The person's character is going to be there no matter what means you're using to communicate with them, and it will show in some form.
So I wanted to share some of the observations the audience members have entered into
Good.
us. Many have said that they didn't realize how much they like being alone or having some time to themselves. It sounds like many people have realized that they enjoy it more than they thought and were completely surprised by it.
Mm-hmm.
Someone else noticed they've felt actually excited, stirred up in some way, in a positive way. Another audience member mentioned she's been singing kind of defiant songs, I will survive, believing it, kind of sounds like telling herself some positive messages.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a question, and I'll try to answer a little bit, and then I'll pass it on to you. It says, do you think keeping yourself busy is a healthy reaction? And what I'd say to that is, I think it depends to the extent that it's helping you keep structure and do something positive. And the potential downside is if that keeps you from looking at things and perceiving what's happening with the pandemic or your family. So it depends on the function of being busy. But Dr. Crist, what do you think?
Yeah, again, I absolutely agree with you. When we say function, it's going back to that simple understanding of looking at the effect. So it's not just the immediate effect of being busy, but what is the overall effect on the person. So yeah, busyness can be a way of avoiding things, or it can be a way of being productive. And so I want to show one other, one of my favorite slides that illustrates a basic principle that I think we are all, let me get my pointer here. We're all born with a particular nature, and we develop a character around that. And then we develop a facade or a personality that is how we interact with the world, with both our nature and our character. And I've seen exactly the same thing the person described. Is the fellow whose email I read you in the course of his therapy. I believe he is extroverted by nature, but he's developed an introverted character, meaning he avoids people because he was traumatized as a child, I think is the reason. And he doesn't, it's hard for him to trust people. But one of his reactions in this situation was when his office was closed down, he said, "I'm just at home." He said, I spend so much time at home, and I like being away from people because I don't like dealing with them. But he said, I really miss just bumping into people in the office. So again, you can't ascribe a blanket approach to everybody. One person may have an introverted nature and need more solitude, and they may have been living with a more extroverted character and not realize how much they actually had that need for solitude. And the introverted versus extroverted, I like the Myers-Briggs definition of, do you derive energy from solitude or do you derive energy from contact with people? So again, understanding character is really so important in helping us, to look at each person individually. Okay.
So a few more observations that have come up. Multiple people happily have mentioned feeling closer to their family, to their spouse or their children, and having more time to be with them in a meaningful way. That's wonderful to hear.
Yes, yes. Yeah, and I think that's the flip side of what I was saying is with additional closeness, it's going to bring out whatever's there. So if things are going well, there will be more enjoyment. If there are problems, it will aggravate those problems. And in fact, I think it's fairly well documented already. The incidence of domestic abuse has gone up just with everybody under pressure. But that part I want to underscore is that there is always that positive side of each thing that can be a problem.
I don't know if you want to answer this now, but there have been a few questions on the rational role of government in dealing with this and the what should be done, maybe not specifically, but in a broad sense.
I'm not going to, obviously, we had a whole, was a 12-week course on socio-political orgonomy a couple of years ago, and a whole section on that discussed the rational role of government. But because, actually, if I share this same slide again, if this healthy nature develops a neurotic or destructive, or what we might call an emotional plague reaction in it, the function of the rational function of government is to support the healthy functions and to restrain the destructive or irrational, what we call the difference between the primary healthy ones and the secondary destructive ones. So that's the rational role of government. That as long as human beings have armoring and neurosis, we're going to need government. So anarchy just has not worked very well in the human species. Okay.
a few audience members asked if you could talk a little bit more about your experience with online sessions during the pandemic, how that's affected things as compared to being in person.
Yeah. Um, every single patient that I've done online sessions with has had, every single one of them has had the reaction afterwards of, God, I didn't think this was going to be that helpful, but I'm surprised. It's not the same as in person, but it's more helpful than I thought it was going to be. And so as I was describing, if I know somebody, I can use what I see on the video screen to help me sort of replicate what my gut sense would be being in person with them. I have not yet seen a new patient that online where I've seen them first online, and I've sort of said I would never do that. I never say never, so I don't know. But as I said, the person's tone of voice, their facial expressions, still there's a tremendous amount you can see, and just their body attitude and how they're dealing with things. It all comes through on video.
I would agree with you.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I have noticed myself both that I've been pleasantly surprised at how much could be done over video conferencing with my patients, and many of them too. There have been a few who, like that one patient you mentioned, I think that was a way of kind of avoiding the reality of the situation. But if we're not doing it on video conferencing, that means everything's fine. But many have been pleasantly surprised at how much work we've been able to do in video conferencing. And I have noticed some actual benefits of it in some circumstances. And maybe after I mention it, you can say if you've noticed that. But eye contact being so important almost becomes accentuated when we're doing teleconferencing. And sometimes there's technical aspects of the distance between the screen and the camera, but often it's, I think, brought that out more. So some of my patients, I might ask them about it, and that'll bring that to the fore of that either they're not looking at the camera on purpose, or they're looking at a specific spot to avoid doing so. And that's brought up a whole host of things for that patient and their individual therapy that maybe wouldn't have come out so clearly in person, where the things are just a little bit different as far as how you're looking at the screen. But Dr. Crist, have you noticed anything?
Yeah. I think I just sort of instinctively sense the same thing, but you put it into words very nicely, is that every time you look at things in a new way, you're going to see things you didn't otherwise. I don't know if you were trained in medical school looking at chest x-rays. If you turn it around and look at it upside down, you're going to see things because you're not expecting what to see. And the same is true with patients. You can get into a routine of seeing the same thing every time, and this has forced us to look at things differently, and that's a benefit. Something that I hope we can carry over, of just finding other ways to look at our patients differently.
So another question that came up, someone had the impression that some people like wearing masks, and the restrictions from the outside, meaning any authority figures, I think. And the question was, they were curious about how those people may adjust to going back to a world without the coronavirus. Do you have any thoughts or feelings about that?
That's an intriguing thought. And I have a young man who I see in therapy, has a schizophrenic character, but he has that very deep way of looking at things. And he said, once the masks came up, he said, everybody reacts to that differently, don't they? My mother started sewing masks for everybody, and the guy in the post office told me when he sees someone with a mask, he wants to rip it off them. So it's like the mask is more than just a necessary means to protect one from the virus. I think it's interesting that that person is commenting on. That makes perfect sense. Anytime you pick up some new way of going about things, it can either be used constructively, positively, or defensively. And I hadn't really thought about it, but I have the sense often seeing somebody drive down the road with a mask on in their car. It's like, what is that for? That it's sort of like a badge, that it has some symbolic meaning rather than a practical utility. So will people have trouble? Some people that want to hide will probably have trouble going back to walking around without a mask.
Yeah, what's come up with me and some of my patients is being quarantined with family. So for instance, adolescents and young adults, if their tendency is to hide, they can do that. They can't do it as well if they're stuck around other people. So I have a patient who he will avoid people if he has strong emotions, will stay away, and he's been unable to do that. So that's been a challenge for him in these times because he doesn't have one of his normal defenses to escape.
Yeah. I mean, that's a very crucial point to put across with everybody is that because there's such disruption, almost everybody has some sort of disruption of their normal defenses. Our way of going about our lives is what our character is a reflection of.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Crist, any closing thoughts, ideas you wanted to share with the group before we finish?
I actually had one more video that I wanted to share.
Sure.
This is a flock of starlings, what they call murmuration of starlings. And what I would say about that is if human beings could only overcome all of their neurosis and be able to live spontaneously, the note in that YouTube video said, we know a lot of factual information about the starling, its size and voice, where it lives, how it breeds and migrates, but what remains a mystery is how it flies in murmurations or flocks without colliding. So if human beings could only find a way to live from that spontaneous nature and function together spontaneously without colliding and hurting each other, that's my hope and dream for the future.
That's beautiful. I wanted to answer a few more questions before we finish. Some people have asked about the video and the slides, and you can certainly contact the ACO to get that information if you like. And someone else asked about obtaining medical orgone therapy. You can contact the ACO via the website or the phone to find out what's available.
Yeah, the other thing I would say that there will be a follow-up email that goes out with a survey. We absolutely look forward to and welcome your comments about this webinar, what worked for you, what didn't, and that will also have a link to, we will be posting a video of this presentation on YouTube, on the ACO YouTube channel. That email, I think, is automatically generated by Zoom, so we'll have a link to the Zoom recording, but we'll also include a link to the YouTube recording of it.
And lastly, the audience wants to know if there'll be any more webinars.
Yes, there will be more webinars. And in fact, the fact that we got so many people from a distance from where our headquarters is near Princeton reconfirms my sense that this is one other positive thing that I believe will come out of the pandemic, is we've been forced to come into the 21st century and do live streaming events. So as long as the restrictions are there for the pandemic, we will have more presentations in this format. But going forward, I really envision that we will have both live presentations where people can be present and discuss, but we will stream those at the same time for people who are at a distance. So absolutely, this is just the beginning of what we're trying out as new ways of contacting the public. So I appreciate everybody who attended, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Wonderful.
So also make a comment about, I think there'll be a follow-up slide on the screen with, but certainly look for the podcasts. And thank you, Dr. Burritt, for doing the podcast. I think you just posted a new one.
Thank you, Dr. Crist. Yeah, it's available on Apple Podcasts and all the other podcast apps.
All right. Well, thank you for your participation. Thank everybody, and we hope to see you in the future.